The tray nearly slipped out of my hands when Colonel Briggs shoved his chair back so hard it slammed into the wall. The whole briefing room went dead quiet. I remember the sound more than anything else. Not the chair, not the officers turning toward me. It was the little crackle from the cheap plastic water bottles rattling against each other while my hands shook. Colonel Nathan Briggs stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. Then he said very slowly, "I've been looking for you for 13 years, Staff Sergeant Mercer." You could feel the air leave the room. Major Denise Holloway looked from him to me so fast I thought she might pull something in her neck. 10 seconds earlier she'd been treating me like part of the furniture. Now suddenly I mattered. And believe me, that scared her more than it scared me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 weeks earlier, I'd driven into Fort Liberty just after sunrise with everything I owned, packed into a gray Ford Explorer that smelled faintly like old coffee and wet dog, because my ex-husband had kept the golden retriever in the divorce, but apparently not the dog hair. North Carolina heat was already climbing, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Sweat glued my t-shirt to my back while I waited at the gate checkpoint behind a contractor truck carrying portable generators. I remember feeling hopeful. That sounds stupid now. After 15 years in Army logistics, I thought finally getting assigned to a Special Operations Support Command meant somebody had noticed my work. I figured maybe I'd earned my way into something meaningful. Field coordination, recovery planning, operational support. Something with responsibility. Instead, Major Holloway took one look at my file and decided exactly who I was before I even sat down. She was tall, polished, one of those officers who looked expensive even in camouflage. Perfect nails, perfect posture, office smelled like lemon cleaner and black coffee. She flipped through my personnel packet without much interest. "Logistics," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." "You ever see direct combat?" "No, ma'am." That little sound told me everything. Not anger, worse. Dismissal. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, every unit needs support staff." Support staff, like I was applying to manage a hotel buffet. The first week she kept me out of every operational briefing, every single one. At first I thought maybe it was a clearance issue, or scheduling. Then Thursday morning she handed me a clipboard and said, "Conference room needs restocked waters before regional command arrives tomorrow." I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. That became my life for the next few weeks. Coffee setup, visitor escorts, inventory counts nobody else wanted, supply closet audits. Meanwhile, younger soldiers with half my experience got invited into mission prep meetings. One afternoon I passed the operations room and saw a lieutenant I'd trained 2 years earlier standing at the digital board giving recommendations on convoy routing. He avoided eye contact when he saw me carrying copier paper. That one stung more than I expected. The worst part wasn't even Holloway herself. It was how quickly everybody else adapted to her opinion of me. That's the thing people don't tell you about humiliation. Most folks don't join in because they're cruel. They join in because it's easier. A week later, I was setting up coffee for a joint briefing when Holloway walked in with 2 captains behind her. She glanced at the cups and said, "Mercer, make sure the lids are tight this time." I blinked. "Ma'am, last thing we need is another tactical disaster." The captains laughed immediately. Not because it was funny, because she outranked them. I smiled anyway, small, professional. Inside, though, I felt something shrinking. That night, I sat alone in my off-base apartment eating microwave meatloaf from Food Lion while rain tapped against the kitchen window. My apartment still had unpacked boxes stacked near the wall. Half my life looked temporary. I pulled out one of my father's old cassette tapes from a shoebox in the closet. I didn't play it. Just held it for a minute. My father, Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer, disappeared in Afghanistan in 2012, officially listed as killed during an extraction mission. No body recovered. For years, I told myself joining logistics had been practical, stable. Truth was, I never stopped trying to understand what happened to him. A few days later, I met Earl Watkins. Earl worked nights cleaning administrative buildings around the command offices. Vietnam veteran, 70-something years old. Walked with a limp and wore old flannel shirts under his maintenance vest, no matter how hot it got. First time we talked, I was refilling bottled water in the conference room at almost 9 at night. Earl watched me stack cases for a minute and said, "You got the posture of somebody trying not to punch people." I laughed before I could stop myself. That was probably why I liked him immediately. Over the next couple weeks, Earl became the only person on base who talked to me like I still existed. One night, he found me staring at a shipment report in the supply office. "What's bothering you?" he asked. I pointed at the screen. "Fuel requests." "What about 'em?" These timestamps are wrong." He leaned closer. I showed him duplicate authorization numbers tied to overnight emergency transfers. Could have been paperwork mistakes. Could have been nothing. But logistics teaches you patterns. And once you see a pattern, it's hard to unsee it. Earl studied me quietly. Then he said, "Places like this don't fear loud people." I looked over. They fear useful people. That line stayed with me. A few days later, I overheard two younger specialists talking outside the vending machines. One of these days, they'll promote her to head waitress. The other guy snorted. Maybe she can deploy paper towels into combat. I kept walking like I hadn't heard them. About an hour later, one of those same soldiers stopped by my desk looking nervous. Staff Sergeant Mercer." "Yeah. You're good with payroll systems, right?" Turns out his housing allowance paperwork got messed up and finance had been ignoring him for weeks. I fixed it in 15 minutes. Before he left, he said quietly, "Thanks." Didn't apologize, though. People usually don't. Then came the regional command meeting. Big room, senior officers everywhere. Air smelled like coffee and printer toner. I was carrying a tray of bottled water toward the main table while Holloway reviewed briefing folders near the projector screen. She glanced at me and muttered, "Just set them down and stay out of the way." Then Colonel Briggs looked up. And everything changed. Nobody moved for a second after Colonel Briggs said my name. You could hear the projector humming against the far wall. Major Holloway recovered first. She stepped toward me, fast, voice-clipped and irritated. "Staff Sergeant Mercer. I specifically instructed you to leave the trays and exit the room." Briggs didn't even look at her. "Major," he said calmly, "do you have any idea who works under you?" That shut the room down even harder. I remember standing there holding a half-empty tray like an idiot while 12 senior officers stared at me. Holloway's expression changed almost instantly, not softer, sharper. "Careful." "No, sir," she said slowly. Briggs finally stood up fully. He was older than I expected up close. Late 60s, maybe. Thick gray hair, broad shoulders, the kind of face that looked carved out of old wood. He carried himself like somebody who'd spent 40 years making decisions nobody else wanted. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're Daniel Mercer's daughter." It wasn't a question. My throat tightened before I could answer. "Yes, sir." One of the officers near the end of the table frowned slightly. "Mercer." Briggs ignored him. "How long have you been assigned here?" 3 weeks, sir." His jaw flexed once. Then he looked directly at Holloway. "Interesting. That one word hit harder than yelling would've." Holloway straightened immediately. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Mercer was assigned temporary support responsibilities while we evaluated." Briggs cut her off. "Bring your briefing folders," he told the room. "We'll reconvene in 20. Nobody argued. As officers started filing out, I bent awkwardly to collect water bottles from the table. Briggs stopped me. "Leave those." I froze. "Yes, sir." Holloway gave me a look that could have stripped paint off concrete. That was the moment I realized something important. She wasn't embarrassed. She was nervous. A young captain escorted me down the hallway about 10 minutes later to Briggs's office on the second floor. The whole walk there, people kept glancing at me. Amazing how quickly your value changes once somebody powerful notices you. Briggs's office surprised me. Smaller than I expected. No giant patriotic displays, no polished museum feel. Just old wood shelves, stacks of paper files, black coffee, and framed photos from deployments going back decades. One photo caught my eye immediately. My father, younger, thinner, standing beside Briggs in desert gear somewhere overseas. I stopped walking. Briggs noticed. "That was Kandahar," he said quietly. 2011. I stared at the picture so long I almost forgot to breathe. I hadn't seen that image before. For years, all the Army gave us were formal portraits and folded condolences. Not real life. Not moments. "He talked about you constantly," Briggs said. That almost broke me right there. Instead, I asked, "Why do you know my name?" Briggs motioned for me to sit. Then he did something strange. He opened a manila folder already sitting on his desk. Inside was my career history. Transfers, evaluations, commendations. Every assignment I'd had for over a decade. "I arranged your transfer," he said. I blinked hard. "Sir, you didn't end up here by accident." My stomach tightened. "For 13 years," he continued, "I've been trying to figure out who Daniel Mercer trusted before he disappeared." I stared at him. "He trusted paperwork," Briggs said. "Records, timelines, details, things most people overlook." That sounded exactly like my father. "When you entered logistics," Briggs continued, "I started paying attention. I honestly didn't know what to say. Part of me felt angry suddenly. You tracked my career." I monitored it. That's not better. To my surprise, Briggs almost smiled. No, he admitted. Probably not. Then his expression hardened again. Your father discovered financial irregularities during a recovery operation in Afghanistan in 2012. I leaned forward slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. Officially, Briggs said the mission failed during extraction. Ambush, casualties, missing personnel. That's what they told us. It wasn't the whole story. My chest tightened hard enough to hurt. Briggs stood and walked toward the window overlooking the parking lot below. There were civilian contractors attached to supply movement operations, he said. Emergency authorizations, missing funds, duplicate routing approvals. Every word sounded familiar to me already. Not because I knew the story, because I'd seen similar patterns myself. Even recently. Briggs turned back toward me. Your father started documenting discrepancies. And then he disappeared. The silence after that felt heavy. I looked down at my hands. You think somebody killed him? Briggs took a long breath before answering. I think good soldiers were sacrificed to protect expensive people. That sentence stayed with me. Still does. He sat back down slowly. Before Daniel vanished, he mailed several cassette tapes to a private address connected to your family. I swallowed. I still have some. His eyes sharpened immediately. How many? 6. There should be 7. That hit me like ice water. How do you know that? Because your father told me. I stared at him. He called me 2 nights before the operation, Briggs said quietly. Said if anything happened to him, the truth would survive in pieces. I felt suddenly dizzy. All those years I thought the tapes were personal keepsakes, stories, rambles. My father talking about weather and army chow and bad coffee overseas. I never imagined they might be evidence. Briggs leaned forward. Staff Sergeant Mercer. Did anyone besides you know you kept those tapes? I opened my mouth, stopped. Then I remembered the supply closet. 2 days earlier, Holloway had walked in while I was reorganizing old storage bins near my desk. One cassette tape had briefly fallen from my bag onto the floor. She'd picked it up herself. What's this? She'd asked casually. Old family stuff? She handed it back. But her eyes lingered. Now my pulse started climbing. I may have made a mistake, I said quietly. Briggs's expression changed immediately. Go check your quarters. I drove back to my apartment faster than I should have. Rain clouds were rolling over Fayetteville by then, turning the sky dark gray. Halfway up the apartment stairs, I already knew something was wrong. My door wasn't fully closed. Not wide open. Just slightly off. Enough. I stopped breathing for a second. Then I pushed it open carefully. Nothing looked destroyed. That somehow made it worse. Whoever came inside knew exactly what they wanted. Closet door cracked open. Storage box shifted sideways. My mattress slightly lifted. I walked straight to the shoebox near the back shelf. Opened it. 5 tapes, not 6. 1 was gone. And suddenly, for the first time since arriving at Fort Liberty, I understood this wasn't workplace humiliation anymore. Somebody was scared. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside my apartment snapped me awake. Car doors, footsteps, somebody's muffler rattling in the parking lot around 2 in the morning. By sunrise, I'd given up trying. I sat at my kitchen counter drinking burnt coffee from a chipped army mug while staring at the 5 cassette tapes lined up beside the toaster like evidence in a murder trial. For 13 years they'd been memories. Now they felt dangerous. I drove onto base just before 7. Gray clouds hung low over Fort Liberty and the whole place smelled like wet pavement and diesel fuel. I went straight to Major Holloway's office. She didn't even look up when I knocked. Make it quick, Mercer. I shut the door behind me. Someone broke into my apartment. That got her attention. Slightly. She leaned back in her chair, expression blank. Were valuables taken? 1 item. What item? I hesitated. A personal family tape. Her eyes flickered for half a second. Tiny movement. But I saw it. And you're reporting this because my door was forced open. Did you contact local police? Yes, ma'am. And they found no clear signs of theft besides the missing item. Holloway folded her hands neatly across her desk. Staff sergeant people going through divorces, transfers, stress-related adjustment periods sometimes become overly suspicious. I stared at her. My apartment was searched. Or, she said calmly, you misplaced something emotionally important and want the situation to feel larger than it is. That was the first moment I genuinely disliked her. Not because she insulted me, because she did it so professionally. I left without arguing. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard her office door lock behind me. That stayed with me too. The next few days got strange. Not dramatic. Worse. Quiet. My base credentials suddenly stopped working at buildings I'd already been cleared for. Inventory files I'd reviewed disappeared from shared systems. One afternoon I opened a supply spreadsheet and found entire shipment logs erased overnight. When I asked IT, they claimed the records had never existed. That bothered me more than direct threats would have, because somebody wasn't trying to scare me. They were trying to make me doubt myself. Thursday evening I found a folded yellow sticky note inside my desk drawer. 3 words: "Stop digging!" No signature. No handwriting I recognized. I sat there staring at it while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because after years of being invisible, suddenly somebody considered me dangerous enough to warn. That night I found Earl cleaning hallway floors outside the admin wing. He took one look at my face and said, "Well, either you discovered corruption or the chow hall switched to powdered eggs again." I handed him the note. He read it silently. "Cute," he muttered. "You think I'm overreacting?" "No," he said immediately. "I think somebody finally realized you notice things." Earl had worked on base long enough to know where old security backups were stored. Around 9 that night, we sat inside a cramped maintenance office drinking vending machine coffee while he pulled hallway footage from an older archived system. "You'd be amazed what survives because nobody updates government computers," he muttered. The footage quality looked terrible. Grainy black and white timestamps. Hallways flickering under motion sensors. At one point, Earl suddenly paused the screen. "Well," he said, "that explains the disappearing protein bars." A lieutenant colonel appeared on camera sneaking into a break room refrigerator around midnight, stuffing chocolate peanut butter bars into his cargo pockets. I laughed so hard coffee nearly came out my nose. "I knew it," Earl said proudly. "Man's been stealing snacks since Easter." For about 30 seconds, everything felt normal again. Then the hallway footage shifted to my building. A figure appeared near my apartment corridor just after midnight 2 nights earlier, face hidden under a hood. But the jacket was visible. Command staff issue. Special Operations Support insignia. Earl froze the frame. "You recognize it?" I nodded slowly. Major Holloway's section used those jackets during field inspections. Could have belonged to anyone in her command. But it wasn't random anymore. I drove home uneasy that night. Not frightened exactly. More like watched. The next morning, Colonel Briggs summoned me again. This time he skipped small talk entirely. "Your father knew the operation reports were altered," he said the second I sat down. Rain tapped softly against his office windows. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were old contractor payment records from Afghanistan. Most people would have fallen asleep looking at them. I didn't. Duplicate invoice numbers. Emergency fuel reimbursements approved twice. Storage facilities billed that didn't exist anymore. The same kind of patterns I'd already noticed at Fort Liberty. Briggs studied me quietly while I flipped pages. "You see it?" "Yeah." He saw it too. I swallowed hard. Briggs leaned back slowly. The contractors involved had connections to senior command structures, political people, expensive people. "You think my father threatened them?" "I think he made himself inconvenient." That sentence hit harder than dramatic words ever could. Inconvenient. Like human beings could simply become administrative problems. Briggs rubbed his jaw tiredly. "Daniel started documenting everything independently. He trusted systems more than people. That sounds like him. He believed records eventually betray liars." For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell my family any of this before now?" Briggs looked older suddenly. "Because I couldn't prove it." That answer felt honest. Painfully honest. That night back at my apartment, I finally played one of the cassette tapes again for the first time in years. Static crackled softly. Then my father's voice filled the room. Calm, familiar. "Hey kiddo," he said, "if this tape reached you, military mail still moves slower than frozen syrup." I laughed before tears hit me. I sat on my kitchen floor listening while rain hit the windows outside. My father talked about terrible coffee overseas, dust storms, how he missed North Carolina barbecue. Then his tone shifted slightly. "If something ever feels wrong," he said quietly, "pay attention to paperwork. Numbers tell on people." I closed my eyes hard. For years I thought he was rambling. Now every sentence sounded deliberate. Around midnight I finally shut the tape off and headed to bed. I almost missed it. A pair of headlights sitting across the apartment parking lot. Engine running. Not moving. Watching. The car pulled away slowly once my bedroom light switched off. I stood there in the dark for a long time afterward. And for the first time I started believing somebody truly wanted this buried. The strange thing about being underestimated for long enough is, eventually people stop hiding things around you. That was the mistake Major Holloway made. By then, most people at the command barely looked at me anymore unless they needed coffee refilled or a spreadsheet fixed. I'd become background noise. Harmless, forgettable. And honestly, part of me had started believing it too. But after the break-in and the missing tape, something changed in me. I stopped trying to earn respect. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. For weeks, I'd kept hoping if I worked harder, stayed calmer, proved myself enough. Eventually, somebody would see me differently. Then, one morning, I caught my reflection in the supply office microwave door while reheating oatmeal, and I realized I looked tired all the time. Small. Careful. Like somebody asking permission to exist. I was done with that. So instead of chasing approval, I started paying attention. Real attention. Not just to people. To systems. Most folks think logistics is boring because they only notice it when it fails. But movement tells stories. Fuel, shipping manifests, maintenance requests, emergency authorizations. Every bad decision leaves fingerprints somewhere. And Fort Liberty had fingerprints everywhere. I started arriving early before most of the admin staff came in. Around 6:30, the building stayed quiet except for vending machines humming and the cleaning crews moving through hallways. That gave me time. I built timelines first. Shipment transfers, contractor approvals, overnight routing changes. At first, the irregularities looked random. Then patterns emerged. The same emergency vendor IDs kept appearing during after-hours authorization windows. Maintenance requests were being altered after audit reviews. Fuel transfers were approved for vehicles that had already been decommissioned. And somebody kept rerouting equipment through storage facilities that technically didn't exist anymore. That part bothered me the most. Fake locations meant somebody expected nobody to check physical inventory, which usually meant money, big money. One Tuesday morning, I sat at my desk staring at a shipment chain when Earl walked by carrying a mop bucket. "You got your war face on," he muttered. "I think somebody's laundering contract payments through dead storage sites." Earl stopped walking. "Well," he said, "that's definitely more exciting than my morning." I turned the monitor slightly toward him. "These approval windows happen almost entirely overnight. Meaning whoever's signing them doesn't want daytime visibility." Earl whistled softly. "You know, he said most people would have transferred out by now." "Thought about it. But..." I leaned back in my chair. "My father used to say if something ugly survives long enough, it starts depending on everybody being tired." Earl nodded slowly like that made perfect sense. Then he pointed his coffee cup toward me. "That right there. That's why people like Holloway fear people like you." I didn't answer, because part of me still wasn't sure I wanted to believe that. A few days later, Holloway called me into a command review meeting unexpectedly. Not to participate. To handle paperwork. There were 6 officers around the conference table discussing supply readiness reports, while I stood near the sidewall organizing folders. Halfway through the meeting, Holloway started presenting revised equipment readiness percentages. As she spoke, I noticed one of her transfer totals didn't match the corrected inventory logs I'd reviewed earlier that morning. Just a small discrepancy. But enough. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay quiet. The other part was tired of shrinking. "Ma'am," I said carefully. Holloway stopped mid-sentence. "What?" The room turned toward me immediately. I kept my voice calm. "I think the transfer total on page 4 still includes the retired vehicle inventory from March." Silence. One colonel flipped pages. Another officer frowned down at his report. Then somebody quietly said, "She's right." Holloway's expression tightened instantly. Not explosive anger. Worse. Embarrassment. She corrected herself quickly and moved on, but the room had shifted. People noticed. Afterward, she cornered me near the hallway printers. "You enjoy making me look incompetent." "No, ma'am." "Then learn when to keep your mouth shut." I met her eyes carefully. "With respect, ma'am, inaccurate logistics reports become operational problems." For one second, I thought she might actually slap me. Instead, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You think being clever makes you dangerous?" That sentence landed strangely, not mocking. Personal. Then she walked away. That night, I couldn't stop replaying it. Around 10, I drove to a storage facility outside Spring Lake where I kept old family boxes from after my divorce. Rain hammered the metal roof while I dug through dusty containers under flickering lights. Old uniforms, tax records, my father's fishing gear. Then I found the toolbox. Rusty red metal, heavy as concrete. I almost overlooked it, until I remembered something from childhood. My father hiding important things in places nobody important ever cleaned. Under garage shelves, inside old tackle boxes, beneath loose floorboards. People only search places they think matter, he used to tell me. My pulse picked up. I opened the toolbox slowly. Inside sat old wrenches, electrical tape, faded mechanic gloves, and one cassette tape wrapped in a shop rag. Number 7. I just stared at it for a second. After 13 years, I sat down right there on the concrete floor while rain pounded outside. Then my phone rang. Colonel Briggs, you found something, he said immediately. How did you know? Because your voice changed. I looked down at the tape in my hand. I found the last cassette. Long silence. Then Briggs exhaled slowly. Listen to me carefully, Rachel. That was the first time he'd used my first name. Whatever's on that tape, he continued, people buried careers to keep hidden. I leaned back against the storage wall. You think Holloway knows? Another pause. Then Briggs said quietly, I think Denise Holloway knew exactly who you were the day you arrived. Cold moved through my stomach. Suddenly, all the humiliation made sense. The isolation. The meaningless assignments. The way she kept me out of briefings. She wasn't dismissing me. She was containing me. I closed my eyes hard. All those weeks I thought I was being treated like I didn't matter. But the truth was much worse. I mattered enough to scare somebody. The second regional command meeting happened on a Thursday morning. Bright sun, clear skies, humid enough to make your uniform stick to your back before 8 a.m. I remember stupid details when I'm nervous. The smell of burnt coffee drifting down the hallway. Somebody laughing too loudly near the elevators. The squeak of my shoes against polished tile while I carried another tray of bottled water toward conference room B. By then, word had spread that Colonel Briggs had taken an interest in me. Nobody knew why exactly, but people noticed changes fast in military buildings. Soldiers who ignored me for weeks suddenly nodded hello. A captain held the door open for me that morning like I was suddenly a person again. Funny how rank works even when it's borrowed. Inside the conference room, officers shuffled through briefing folders, while Major Holloway stood near the projection screen reviewing notes. Perfect uniform. Perfect posture. But she looked tired. The kind of tired people get when they haven't slept because they know something's coming and can't stop it. She saw me enter with the water tray and gave a small smirk. Right on time, Mercer. I didn't answer. I just started setting bottles along the table. One of the lieutenant colonels muttered under his breath, Careful, she might audit the water inventory. A few people chuckled politely. I noticed Holloway didn't. Then Colonel Briggs walked in. No greeting. No small talk. He closed the conference room door behind him and said, Before we begin, Staff Sergeant Mercer will remain in the room. That got everybody's attention immediately. Holloway spoke carefully. Sir Mercer isn't cleared for portions of this briefing. She is now. Flat, final. Briggs walked to the head of the table carrying a thin manila folder and an old cassette player. An actual cassette player. You could practically feel the confusion in the room. One officer even gave a quiet laugh. Sir, another man said cautiously, What exactly is this regarding? Briggs sat down slowly. Accountability. Nobody spoke after that. I stood near the side wall gripping the edge of the tray harder than I realized. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought people might hear it. Briggs looked toward me. Rachel. Not Mercer. Rachel. Play the tape. Every eye in the room turned toward me. For one second, I honestly considered walking out. Not because I was scared of Holloway anymore. Because I suddenly understood this was the point where things stopped being reversible. Once truth enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. I walked to the cassette player and slid tape number 7 into place. The click sounded impossibly loud. Then static filled the room. A few officers shifted impatiently. And then my father's voice came through the speakers. Calm. Steady. Tired. If this recording gets played, he said, it means somebody finally stopped ignoring the numbers. Every person in that room went still. My chest tightened so hard it physically hurt hearing him again. Certain supply contracts tied to recovery operations have been altered, my father continued. Emergency authorizations rerouted through unauthorized civilian vendors. Duplicate fuel reimbursements approved through command protection. One of the officers frowned deeply. Another started flipping through paperwork. My father kept talking. No dramatic speeches. No conspiracy theory nonsense. Just details. Dates. Shipment IDs. Authorization codes. That was the thing about my father. He trusted evidence more than emotion. The tape ended after about 6 minutes. Silence swallowed the room afterward. Briggs looked toward me once. I knew that was my cue. My hands shook slightly while I connected my laptop to the conference projector. Then I pulled up the timeline I'd spent weeks building. Shipment records. Transfer approvals. Maintenance revisions. Contractor payments routed through facilities that no longer existed. I walked them through everything slowly. No theatrics. Just paperwork. At one point, a colonel near the far end interrupted quietly. These authorization chains overlap command review windows. Yes, sir, I answered. Another officer leaned closer toward the screen. These signatures were modified after audit submission. Yes, sir. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smirked at the woman who carried water trays. Because suddenly the room understood something ugly. The support staff had been paying attention while everybody else was busy protecting reputations. Halfway through the presentation, Briggs finally turned toward Holloway. Would you care to explain your involvement, Major? Holloway stayed perfectly still for several seconds. Then she inhaled carefully. My involvement, she said evenly, was administrative continuity. Briggs's expression didn't change. You buried discrepancies. I stabilized command exposure. You altered reports. I corrected operational vulnerabilities. The room felt electric now. Like everybody understood they were watching a career collapse in real time. Holloway finally looked directly at me. And for the first time since I met her, she seemed honest. You want to know the truth, Mercer, she said quietly. Nobody interrupted her. You know what happens to women in commands like this when they hesitate. When they show uncertainty, they get eaten alive. Her voice sharpened slightly. I spent 22 years surviving officers who smiled in my face while waiting for me to fail. She pointed toward the documents on the screen. You think any of those men would have protected me if I'd exposed this? One of the senior officers shifted uncomfortably. Because deep down, everybody in that room knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Holloway looked back at Briggs. So yes, she continued, I protected command structure, I protected careers, including my own. Then her eyes moved to me again. And when Rachel Mercer arrived here acting exactly like Daniel Mercer, noticing patterns, asking quiet questions, I knew what was coming. There it was. The truth. Not hatred. Fear. Briggs leaned forward slightly. So you isolated her intentionally. Holloway gave a tiny laugh without humor. I made her invisible. That sentence landed harder than yelling ever could. For a second, nobody moved. Then Briggs asked the final question. Did you believe humiliating Staff Sergeant Mercer would prevent the truth from surfacing? Holloway's composure finally cracked. Just slightly. Enough. She looked exhausted suddenly. Old. Yes, she admitted softly. Silence. One officer removed his glasses slowly. Another rubbed both hands across his face. Nobody looked triumphant. That's the strange thing about real corruption. It doesn't feel cinematic when it collapses. It feels sad. Briggs stood carefully. Major Denise Holloway, he said, you are hereby relieved pending formal investigation. Holloway closed her eyes briefly. Then she nodded once like she'd known this moment was coming for years. Military police arrived quietly a few minutes later. No handcuffs. No dramatic scene. She simply picked up her uniform cap and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she paused beside me. You know the worst part? She asked quietly. I didn't answer. She looked toward the officers around the table. They'll respect you now. Then she walked out. The room stayed silent after the door closed. I stood there holding my father's final cassette tape while senior officers avoided my eyes. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Liberty, nobody looked through me anymore. Fort Liberty got very quiet after the investigation started. Not publicly. Publicly, everything looked normal. Morning formations still happened. Humvees still rolled across base roads. Officers still carried coffee into meetings pretending the world made sense. But underneath all that, everybody knew. You could feel it in the hallways. Conversations stopping when certain names came up. People suddenly double-checking paperwork they used to rubber stamp. Senior officers retiring for family reasons. Contractors quietly disappearing from approved vendor lists. The Army has a way of swallowing scandals without making much noise, like a man smoothing dirt over a fresh hole before the neighbors wake up. A week after the conference room meeting, Major Holloway officially resigned. No dramatic headlines. No televised disgrace. Just a short internal memo citing personal reasons. Still, people talked. They always do. What surprised me most was how many soldiers suddenly acted like they'd supported me all along. One captain stopped me near the parking lot and said I always knew something about Holloway felt off, which was interesting considering he laughed at her jokes for 3 straight weeks. Another officer shook my hand in the commissary and called me one hell of an investigator. I wasn't an investigator. I was a logistics NCO who got tired of being treated like office decoration. That part mattered to me. Because people love rewriting history once the outcome becomes safe. Colonel Briggs kept me mostly out of the public fallout. I appreciated that. I sat through 2 formal interviews with investigators from Army Criminal Investigation Division, mostly paperwork clarification, shipment chains, authorization records. The funny thing was, none of the evidence looked dramatic on its own. That's how corruption survives. Not through giant movie-style crimes. Tiny compromises. One altered timestamp here. One ignored discrepancy there. 100 people deciding not to ask questions because asking questions slows careers down. One afternoon after an interview session, Briggs walked with me across the parking lot toward headquarters. Humidity hung thick over everything, thunderstorms rolling somewhere in the distance. "You did good work," he said quietly. I gave a tired laugh. "Funny, a month ago people trusted me with bottled water." Briggs glanced sideways at me. People often confuse visibility with value. That sounded like something he'd spent years learning the hard way. We stopped near his vehicle. "There's something else," he said. Then he handed me a folder. Inside was a formal offer for reassignment. Strategic Operations Analysis Division. Permanent position. Better pay, better housing allowance, bigger responsibilities. The kind of assignment people spend careers chasing. And to my own surprise, my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was exhaustion. That night, I sat alone in my apartment staring at the paperwork while an old episode of Wheel of Fortune played quietly on television in the background. I should have been happy. Instead, I kept thinking about Holloway. Not because I forgave her. I didn't. But part of me understood her now in a way I hadn't before. She didn't start out cruel. Nobody does. Somewhere along the line, she learned survival mattered more than truth. Then eventually, she stopped seeing the difference. And honestly, that scared me more than corruption itself, because it felt human. A few evenings later, I found Earl outside the admin building smoking one of his terrible cigars beside the loading dock. "You look miserable for somebody who won," he said. I leaned against the railing beside him. "I don't know if I did win." Earl laughed softly. "That's because you're thinking like a decent person." We stood there quietly for a minute, listening to cicadas buzzing in the trees beyond the parking lot. Finally, I asked, "Did Vietnam mess you up?" Earl took a slow drag before answering. "Vietnam taught me institutions fail constantly." He shrugged. "Still got good people, though." "That enough?" "Usually has to be." He looked over at me carefully. "You know what your problem is, Rachel?" "What?" "You still think disappointment means something wasn't worth believing in." I didn't answer because I knew he was right. A few days later, before sunrise, I drove north toward Arlington National Cemetery. Long drive. Too much time to think. Virginia skies looked pale gray when I arrived. Cool breeze moving through the rows of white headstones. I found my father's grave near the older trees. Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer. I stood there for a long time without speaking. Then I sat on the grass beside the headstone and pulled out the final cassette tape. Not the whole thing, just the ending. My father's voice crackled softly through the headphones. "If you're hearing this, kiddo, he said it means you kept going." I closed my eyes. For years I thought strength looked loud. Confident people, aggressive people, command voices in briefing rooms. But my father understood something I didn't fully grasp until Fort Liberty. Real strength usually arrives quietly. It notices details. It stays patient. And it keeps telling the truth long after lying becomes more convenient. I placed my hand against the cold marble headstone. Then I finally said the thing I should have said years earlier. "I found it, Dad." Wind moved softly through the cemetery trees. For the first time in a very long while, I felt steady. Not triumphant. Not healed completely. Just steady. A month later, I accepted the reassignment. Not because the Army suddenly became perfect. It didn't. But because people like Holloway only understood power when it was loud. My father taught me something different. Useful people matter too, even when nobody notices them at first. And maybe especially then.